traditional sites of the Marshall Islands relate to the stories and legends told by the Marshallese people. The survival of these sites depends upon the recollections of the storyteller and the passing of these traditions to the next generation. With the support of the US National Park Service, staff from the Elaley Museum, Madura, travelled to Jaluit in order to record some of the atoll's traditional sites and the oral traditions to which they are connected. One such story was told by Tina Jorgen, the tale of the great warrior Lane. I'll start the story about Lane and his two brothers, Nijo and Latan. They sailed east from one of the western atolls of the Marshall Islands, called Kwajalein, to Jaluit Atoll. They sailed many days and nights until they reached Bokanake, a small island of Jaluit. They dropped their anchor and Lane went ashore to look for a human giant from the village. Lane himself was no ordinary man. He possessed the crafts of wizardry, sorcery, or magic. With such powers, he knew that he would defeat the giant. The human giant was waiting for him on the beach called Bokan Kotor. For a moment, they stared at each other, and then with the cast of one stone, Lane killed the giant. He went on to kill all the men of Bokanake. After that, the brothers left Bokanake and sailed toward the eastern islands. But before they passed the islands, an old woman who possessed some of the powers similar to Lane went before them and told the people on these islands that Lane had killed the men on Bokanake. And that he and his brothers were on their way toward their islands. The brothers sailed past the islands until they reached Imroj, another small island of Jaluit. They went past the channel between Kinajon and Imroj. There they anchored their canoe to a coral head, leeward of a shoal called Nawitak. It was morning and the tide was low. When the men on Imroj were informed that Lane and his brothers were at this place, they went after them. By the time they reached the brothers, the tide was already high, and with all the power that Lane possessed, he whipped them all with his paddle and killed them. Lane and his brothers left Imroj and headed on to a secondary lagoon on the lagoon side of another small island called Namola, where they waited for dawn. When dawn came, the men on Mojai, a small island close to Namola, saw their canoe. The men headed to where Lane and his brothers were. When the brothers saw them coming their way, they waited until the men came nearer. Lane and his brothers went toward the approaching men and started whipping them until no one was left. Nijo, Lane's second brother, ran away. He ran towards a passage. He ran towards a passage between Laniran, another small island, and Namola, and waited for his brothers. Lane and the other brother went after him, and when they reached him, Lane told him that he was a coward, and that was why he'd ran away. Lane then applied his power to his brother. After applying this power, they sailed again early in the evening. This time they were heading to Cabin Ilan N to kill all the men there. They sailed all night, and by the time they reached the villages, all the men were out fishing. They went ashore on the island of Ai, one of the small islands at Cabin Ilan N of Jaluit Atoll, and beached their canoe. They went to a nearby house. Outside the house was a pit or trench which Lane and his brothers used to rest and sleep in. Around about midnight, Lane told one of his brothers to keep a watchful eye on the lagoon to see if anybody was voyaging during the night, and if so, to see where they would stop for the night. The brother saw one canoe coming in and knew where it was. He went back to his brothers and told them. The villagers didn't sleep that night, for they were awaiting the fishermen. And then everyone was up eating fish and other foods. While Lane and his brothers were sleeping, an old woman brought them a big basket full of fish and coconuts. The old woman, though, knew what the three had done to the men at Bokanake and the other islands they had visited, but didn't warn the people of Ai where they were. This was Lane's magical powers at work, always keeping them safe and avoiding any ill-fated incidents that might befall them. They ate the food the old woman brought them. Then Lane told his brothers, "When it's almost time for the tide to come in, we'll pull out our canoe." When dawn came, the tide was coming in, so Lane and his brothers launched the canoe as planned. They made for a coral head at the channel, close to the far end of Ai Island, and paused until the people noticed they were waiting at anchor. This made the men eager to capture the strangers. The tide was still coming in. By the time they reached Lane and his brothers, it was already at its high point. The men were floating and swimming. Lane and his brothers had no trouble killing them. They used their paddles to hit the men in the water. When they were all killed, the three men headed back towards Kwajalein. The only surviving men of Jaluit were the men of Image, Jabot and Jaluit. On their way to Kwajalein, the chief of Jaluit, Kaiboki, was on his way home. As the two parties were about to pass each other, Lane instructed his brothers not to say a word to the chief until he had fully passed them, and he also instructed them to pull the sail up for a speedy getaway. The chief greeted them and asked them where they'd been. When the chief's canoe passed them in the other direction, they started to reply that they were just at Jaluit. The chief asked them how things were on Jaluit, and they replied, "You go back and look at your pot," which is a place where the chief grew his fruit plants. From the way they replied, the chief knew that they had killed all the men on Jaluit, and he told his crew. The next story is the legend of Lokobar, told by Janari Leon. The story I'm talking about occurs at Ai. Ai is a small island of Jaluit Atoll. It's one of the islands that the great warrior Lane visited and killed all the men, as was mentioned in the story earlier. So this island of Ai is also the location for the story of Lokobar. Lokobar, as is told in this story, was a very handsome and popular man who turned into a tree. He had his way with all the women on the island, except one of the women of Majirok, an island very close to Ai. Every time he saw this woman, he acted differently. He would always show off and perform strange dances whenever he saw the woman. People noticed it whenever they saw the leaves on this tree turning red. They knew then that Lokobar was showing off again to the woman on Majirok.
Error like it, they won't kill all men killed and go around. Columbus, two general running, running around, we send him to the around. Ewa, Columbus Lokobar in the good, Columbus Kagal, all men put in purr. And Edan Jimmy.
Today, this is still happening. The leaves on this tree turn red during the month of July, according to the storyteller. The name of the woman on Majirok is Linintok. She has turned into a rock. The rock is located on the south of Majirok, lagoon side. Lokobar is located in a pit on I Island. And running the better, a porraino, a purr. A 1 minute moving.